At the river Granicus, Alexander attacked with perhaps 18,000 men against a Persian force that could field more cavalry on the spot than he had horsemen in total. At Issus, he faced a king whose empire stretched from the Aegean to Central Asia. At Gaugamela, he rode toward an army that may have outnumbered him 2-1 on ground prepared for his destruction. By every conventional measure, this campaign should have ended in failure. And yet, in barely a decade, the young king of a rough northern kingdom shattered the greatest superpower of his age. So what broke first? Persia's armies or Persia's system? Why did overwhelming numbers repeatedly fail against a smaller, harder force? And was Alexander's greatest weapon not the phalanx or the companion cavalry, but a style of command so aggressive, so personal, that it carried within it the seed of eventual ruin? To understand that, we have to begin before the victories, when Macedonia was still underestimated and Persia still looked unshakable. By the late 4th century BC, the Greek world had spent nearly a century fighting itself. The long struggle between Athens and Sparta, followed by decades of shifting alliances and bitter regional wars, had exhausted the traditional powers of southern Greece. Armies still marched, but the old balance had collapsed. Into this fractured landscape stepped a kingdom many Greeks had once dismissed as peripheral, Macedonia. Under King Philip II, that kingdom was transformed into something new, a disciplined military system designed for decisive war. Philip's reforms reshaped the battlefield. The Macedonian phalanx, armed with the long sarissa pike, created a formation of extraordinary reach and cohesion, while cavalry and light infantry were integrated into a flexible combined arms force. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, this machine proved its power. The allied armies of Athens and Thebes were crushed. Greece was no longer a patchwork of rival states. It now stood, willingly or not, under Macedonian leadership. Philip's ambition extended beyond Greece. He planned a great campaign against the Persian Empire, presenting it as a united Greek war of retribution against an old imperial enemy. But in 336 BC, before the expedition could begin, Philip was assassinated by a member of his own court. The throne passed suddenly to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. The succession was anything but secure. Rival claimants existed within Macedonia itself. Several Greek cities saw an opportunity to revolt. Alexander moved with speed and calculated brutality, eliminating potential challengers and reasserting Macedonian authority across Greece. By the spring of 334 BC, the young king had secured his position. Now he could attempt something far more dangerous, leading a relatively small coalition army across the Hellespont to challenge the immense Persian Empire on its own ground. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with roughly 40,000 men. Against the immense resources of the Persian Empire, it was a modest force, but it was built for precision rather than scale. At its core stood the Macedonian phalanx, professional infantry, armed with the 18-foot sarissa, drilled to move as a single wall of spear points. Around that rigid center operated lighter infantry, skirmishers, and the army's decisive arm, the companion cavalry,
elite horsemen trained to strike at the critical moment.
The first test came quickly. Persian satraps in Western Asia Minor assembled their forces along the banks of the river Granicus. It was not an enormous river, but it presented a tactical obstacle: steep banks, uneven footing, and defenders waiting on the far side with cavalry ready to charge any troops attempting the crossing. Most commanders would have delayed, reconnoitered, perhaps waited for a safer opportunity. Alexander did the opposite. He ordered the attack immediately. Companion cavalry splashed into the current, horses struggling against the water as missiles arced down from the opposite bank. Javelins struck shields, arrows cut through the spray. Men climbing onto the far shore found themselves instantly engaged by Persian horsemen charging downhill into the ford. For several minutes, the fight was chaos compressed into a narrow strip of riverbank. Horses collided chest to chest, spears shattered. Men were forced to fight almost vertically as they tried to push up the slope. But the assault had a purpose. While the cavalry fixed the Persian line in brutal close combat, more Macedonian units forced their way across. Then the phalanx arrived, 6 dense blocks of infantry advancing with methodical pressure, sarissas angled forward like a moving barricade of iron. Persian cavalry suddenly faced something their charge could not easily break, a formation that refused to open. Once momentum shifted, it shifted quickly. The Macedonian line expanded across the bank, cavalry maneuvered for flanking blows, and the Persian front began to collapse. What began as a dangerous crossing became a rout. Granicus proved something essential. The Macedonian system worked. Discipline held under pressure, and Alexander's willingness to take calculated risk could destabilize a larger enemy before numbers mattered. But a first victory was not the same as winning the war. Granicus opened the gates of Western Asia Minor, but it did not break the Persian Empire. The empire still possessed enormous reserves of manpower, vast interior territory, and a navy that controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean. More importantly, the great king himself had not yet entered the field. Darius III ruled a system built to absorb setbacks and return with greater force. Alexander had proven he could win a battle. The larger question remained unresolved. Could tactical brilliance survive the scale, wealth, and endurance of an empire that had dominated the Near East for 2 centuries? After Granicus, Alexander moved quickly along the western coast of Asia Minor. The logic was strategic rather than impulsive. Persian naval power depended on bases along the Aegean littoral, and if those ports were neutralized, the fleet itself would become far less dangerous. In 334 BC, cities like Miletus and Halicarnassus resisted fiercely, but one by one they fell. Siege warfare replaced open battle for a time, forcing Alexander to demonstrate patience as well as aggression. By winter, Persian control of the coastline had been severely weakened, and the Macedonian army had secured its line of communication back toward Greece. Yet this progress carried Alexander deeper into hostile territory. The farther he advanced inland, the more the strategic equation shifted. Persia could absorb the loss of provinces. What it could not ignore was the threat to imperial authority itself. So in 333 BC, Darius III finally mobilized the full resources of the empire and marched to confront the invader personally.
The meeting came near the coastal plain of Issus, a narrow corridor squeezed between mountains and sea. On paper, the numbers heavily favored Persia. Darius commanded an army perhaps twice the size of Alexander's force, including experienced Greek mercenaries in the center and powerful cavalry formations positioned to exploit open ground. But the terrain altered the equation. The battlefield narrowed the front, compressing the Persian advantage in numbers and forcing both armies into a more confined engagement. Alexander deployed with calculated familiarity. The phalanx held the center, cavalry guarded the wings, and Alexander himself took position on the right flank with the companion cavalry, where decisive movement would be possible.
When the attack began, the Macedonian advance drove forward with its usual momentum. But midway through the battle, the system nearly broke. In its effort to keep pace with Alexander's maneuver on the right, sections of the phalanx became disordered while crossing the uneven banks of the Pinarus River. The gap was immediate and dangerous. Persian infantry surged into the opening, and the Macedonian center began to buckle. For a moment, the campaign balanced on the edge of collapse. Alexander reacted instantly. Instead of continuing his planned advance along the flank, he wheeled inward with the companion cavalry and drove straight toward the Persian center, toward Darius himself. It was an improvisation born of urgency, but it transformed the battle. As the Macedonian charge smashed into the weakened Persian line, the pressure on the phalanx eased and the momentum shifted once again. To understand why these battles repeatedly tilted in Alexander's favor, it helps to look beyond the dramatic charges and personal duels. The real pattern lies in how he manipulated the battlefield before the decisive moment even arrived. Persia's greatest advantage was scale, more soldiers, more cavalry, and access to vast imperial reserves. Alexander rarely tried to match that strength directly. Instead, he looked for ways to compress it. At Granicus, the river crossing forced Persian cavalry to fight in a crowded front where their numbers could not easily maneuver. At Issus, the narrow coastal plain squeezed an enormous army into a confined corridor between mountains and sea. What appeared to be a disadvantage in numbers became, under the right conditions, a constraint on Persian flexibility. Timing mattered just as much as terrain. Alexander consistently sought the moment when the enemy line was stretched, distracted, or repositioning. Only then did he commit his most powerful instrument, concentrated shock delivered by the companion cavalry. This was not simply cavalry charging at random. It was a deliberate attempt to punch a hole at the precise point where command and morale intersected, often near the opposing leader himself. And finally, there was leadership presence. Alexander fought where the decision would occur. His men could see him. His opponents could see him as well. That visibility carried risk, but it also transmitted momentum through the army's chain of command. Discipline held. Confidence spread forward. Numbers still mattered, but repeatedly, Alexander found ways to ensure that at the decisive point of contact, numbers mattered less than cohesion, timing, and shock. By 331 BC, the campaign had reached its decisive phase. Darius III assembled a vast new army on the plains near Gaugamela, east of the Tigris River. This time, the battlefield favored Persia. The terrain had been deliberately flattened to allow the full deployment of cavalry and scythed chariots. Here, at last, imperial scale could operate without restriction. Alexander faced an army that may have outnumbered his own by a considerable margin. Persian cavalry stretched across a broad front. Chariots waited behind them, blades mounted on their axles. Infantry filled the center in deep formations drawn from across the empire. For Darius, this was the moment to crush the invasion. Alexander deployed with careful precision. The Macedonian phalanx formed the center, as always, dense ranks of sarissas angled forward. Parmenion commanded the left wing with Thessalian cavalry, tasked with absorbing the pressure of the Persian horse. On the right stood Alexander with the companion cavalry and elite infantry, the striking force that would attempt the decisive maneuver. When the armies began to move, Alexander did something unexpected. Instead of charging directly forward, he advanced obliquely toward the right, slowly, deliberately. The movement forced the Persian line to extend in order to prevent being outflanked. Cavalry units shifted, formation stretched. The massive army began to distort as it tried to mirror his motion. Darius responded by launching his chariots. They thundered forward across the plain, blades flashing as they accelerated toward the Macedonian center. But disciplined infantry opened gaps in their ranks, allowing the vehicles to pass through harmlessly, while skirmishers targeted the horses and drivers. Now the opening appeared. Alexander wheeled his companion cavalry inward and charged directly toward the weakened Persian center. The impact was sudden and violent, a concentrated wedge of cavalry driving into the gap created by the shifting Persian line. The phalanx surged forward behind them, reinforcing the breach. Darius saw the danger. The Macedonian king was cutting straight toward his command position. The great king turned his chariot and fled. Persian morale collapsed almost instantly. Across the center of the battlefield, formations dissolved and men began to run. But as Darius fled, Alexander's own army was close to breaking elsewhere. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion's wing was under enormous pressure. Persian cavalry had pushed forward aggressively, threatening to encircle the entire army if the flank collapsed. Alexander faced a brutal decision: pursue the fleeing king and end the war immediately, or turn back to save his own line. He chose the army. Wheeling his cavalry around, Alexander rode back across the battlefield and smashed into the Persian horse pressing Parmenion's flank. The pressure broke. The Persian cavalry withdrew. At Gaugamela, the Persian Empire lost its final chance to destroy the invasion, and the road to its imperial heartlands lay open. The victory at Gaugamela shattered Persian field resistance, but it did not end the campaign. In 330 BC and the years that followed, Alexander pushed deeper into the empire's interior, occupying Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian kingship. There, in a moment heavy with symbolism, the great palace complex was plundered and burned, an act often interpreted as retribution for the Persian destruction of Greek temples generations earlier. Yet the conquest brought new complications. The further Alexander advanced eastward in pursuit of the fleeing Darius and later the usurper Bessus, the more the war changed character. Instead of decisive engagements, the Macedonian army faced revolts, guerrilla resistance, and the slow strain of distance. Within the army itself, tensions began to surface. Officers who had followed Alexander from the beginning struggled to recognize the king they had once served. He adopted elements of Persian court ritual, elevated local elites into positions of authority, and began to imagine a fusion between conqueror and conquered that unsettled many Macedonians. Suspicion hardened into crisis. Several conspiracies were uncovered, real or imagined. Trusted commanders were executed. Old loyalties fractured. The army kept marching. Victories continued. Yet the emotional distance between Alexander and many of his companions widened with every campaign. What had begun as a war of conquest was becoming something more ambiguous, a transformation of empire that even its architects struggled to control. Alexander's campaign did more than defeat an enemy army. It dismantled the Achaemenid Empire, a political system that had dominated the Near East for more than 2 centuries. In its place emerged a new political landscape shaped by Macedonian authority, but infused with Persian administrative traditions and local power structures. Cities founded during the campaign, many bearing Alexander's name, became centers where Greek language, military practices, and philosophical traditions mingled with older cultures across Asia. This fusion produced what historians later called the Hellenistic world. Trade routes expanded, scientific ideas circulated more widely, and political models evolved as successor kingdoms adapted Macedonian military institutions to govern enormous territories. Yet the same campaign that created this transformation also exposed the fragility of conquest. Alexander's empire was vast, but it depended heavily on the personal authority of the men who had built it. Without a clear system of succession, the political structure he forged rested on unstable foundations.
In 323 BC, in the great city of Babylon, Alexander fell suddenly ill and died at the age of 32. He had never lost a battle. His army had marched from Greece to the Indus River, defeating the greatest empire of the age along the way. Yet the system he built proved far harder to hold than to conquer. He left no clear successor, and within months his generals began struggling among themselves for control. The empire fractured, dividing into rival kingdoms ruled by the very commanders who had once marched together. What remained was something less visible, but far more enduring, a transformation of the ancient world and a model of command that would fascinate soldiers and historians for centuries. In the end, the campaign was never decided by numbers alone. It was decided by discipline, morale, leadership, and by a commander who could think, move, and strike faster than an empire built to resist him.